In just 41 seconds, $890 million of pharmaceutical lobbying would become the least damaging revelation in the room. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. didn't retreat when confronted with his own financial contradictions. He doubled down instead. Cameras captured the exact moment his moral authority shattered. The House Oversight Committee chamber fell into a silence so complete that even the court reporters stopped typing. What did Representative Jamie Raskin reveal about Kennedy's funding sources that made the champion of medical transparency look like everything he claimed to oppose? March 19, 2025, 10:47 in the morning. The Rayburn House Office building hummed with an energy that veteran Capitol Hill observers recognized immediately as dangerous. This wasn't routine oversight. This was blood sport disguised as budget review. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walked into hearing room 2154 carrying the confidence of a man who had spent decades challenging institutional power. At 71 years old, Kennedy moved with the measured grace of someone comfortable being the most controversial person in any room. His Navy suit was impeccable, his signature gravelly voice already commanding attention in pre-hearing conversations with staff. What Kennedy didn't know was that across the mahogany divide, Representative Jamie Raskin had spent 6 weeks building a financial case so airtight it would redefine hypocrisy. Raskin entered the chamber like a prosecutor who had already won his case and was simply waiting for the jury to catch up. The Maryland Democrat carried a leather folder stamped with Treasury Department seals, IRS classification markings, and the kind of documentation that ends political careers. At 62, Raskin had earned his reputation as one of Congress's most formidable interrogators, a constitutional law professor who understood that the most devastating questions weren't theatrical, they were mathematical. Behind him, 3 staffers wheeled in boxes containing what would later be described as the most comprehensive financial investigation of a cabinet nominee in modern history. Kennedy's nomination as Health and Human Services Secretary had already survived multiple controversies: his vaccine skepticism, his environmental activism, his family name both blessing and curse. But today wasn't about vaccines or autism or pharmaceutical corruption. Today was about money, specifically whose money had been funding Kennedy's crusade against corporate medicine. The hearing opened with Chairman James Comer's standard procedural remarks, but the tension in the room made small talk impossible. Republican members clearly wanted to move quickly through confirmation, their questions prepared to highlight Kennedy's environmental credentials and his commitment to reducing chronic disease. Democratic members sat with unusual stillness, the kind of predatory patience that suggested they knew something explosive was coming. Kennedy's opening statement lasted 12 minutes, a passionate defense of his record fighting corporate capture of regulatory agencies. He spoke eloquently about mercury in fish, pesticides in food, the revolving door between industry and government. His voice carried genuine conviction as he described children injured by environmental toxins and families bankrupted by medical bills. It was powerful, authentic, and by the end of the day would seem almost tragic in its irony. Representative Raskin's turn came at 11:23. He began not with hostility but with what seemed like genuine curiosity, his tone almost conversational as he thanked Kennedy for his decades of environmental advocacy. Several Democratic staffers exchanged knowing glances. They had seen Raskin work before. This wasn't kindness. This was the calm before systematic destruction. Mr. Kennedy, Raskin began, his voice carrying the measured precision of someone who had taught constitutional law for 30 years. I want to start by acknowledging your criticism of pharmaceutical industry lobbying. You've been quite vocal about this issue. Kennedy nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly at what seemed like friendly territory. Representative, I've spent my career exposing how corporate money corrupts public health policy. The pharmaceutical industry spends approximately $890 million annually lobbying Congress and federal agencies. That kind of financial influence fundamentally distorts medical decision-making and regulatory oversight. $890 million, Raskin repeated, as if committing the number to memory. That's a staggering amount of money. Kennedy leaned forward, his activist instincts fully engaged. It's worse than staggering, Representative. It's systematic corruption. These companies spend more on lobbying than research. They capture the very agencies meant to regulate them. They turn public servants into industry employees. The pharmaceutical lobby is the most powerful force preventing genuine health reform in America. The passion in Kennedy's voice was unmistakable, and several committee members nodded appreciatively. This was the Kennedy that millions of Americans admired, the fearless advocate willing to challenge corporate power regardless of personal cost. Raskin let the words hang in the air for several seconds, his expression neutral but his eyes suggesting he was calculating something complex. Mr. Kennedy, Could you tell the committee about your organization, Children's Health Defense? Of course, Kennedy replied, his tone shifting to one of pride. We're a non-profit dedicated to ending childhood health epidemics by working aggressively to eliminate harmful exposures, hold those responsible accountable, and establish safeguards to prevent future harm. And this organization, Raskin continued, pulling a document from his folder, received how much in donations last fiscal year? Kennedy hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression that experienced interrogators learn to recognize as the moment a witness realizes they might be walking into a trap. Approximately $23 million in the most recent reporting period. $23 million, Raskin echoed. And where does that funding come from? Kennedy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We have a broad base of individual donors who share our concern about children's health and environmental toxins. Individual donors, Raskin repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Would it surprise you to know that my staff has spent the last 6 weeks analyzing your organization's financial disclosures, IRS Form 990 filings, and donor documentation obtained through legal channels? The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Kennedy's hands, which had been resting casually on the witness table, now gripped the edge with slightly more tension. Representative, I'm confident our financial practices comply fully with nonprofit regulations. I'm sure they do, Raskin said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Compliance and transparency are different standards though, aren't they? He opened his folder with theatrical precision, revealing documents that made Kennedy's chief of staff, seated behind him, visibly pale. Mr. Kennedy, are you familiar with the Organic Wellness Institute? Kennedy's face remained carefully neutral, but his voice carried a new edge. I've heard of them. They're involved in alternative health research. They're more than involved, Raskin corrected gently. According to IRS records, the Organic Wellness Institute donated $2.3 million to Children's Health Defense between 2022 and 2024. Kennedy shifted in his chair, a subtle movement that cameras captured from 3 different angles. Many organizations support our work, Representative. We accept donations from anyone who shares our mission. How about the Natural Immunity Foundation? Raskin continued, not waiting for a response. They donated $1.7 million. The Holistic Medicine Alliance? Another $1.1 million. The Chiropractic Research Council? $875,000. Should I continue? The committee room had gone completely silent, every member now understanding that Raskin wasn't asking random questions but systematically building a case. These are legitimate health advocacy organizations, Kennedy said, his voice strained but still attempting confidence. They support research into alternatives to pharmaceutical interventions. Alternatives to pharmaceutical interventions, Raskin repeated, his prosecutorial instincts now fully visible. Mr. Kennedy, would it interest you to know that the Organic Wellness Institute's primary revenue comes from selling supplements that make unverified health claims? That the Natural Immunity Foundation is funded almost entirely by chiropractors whose business model depends on patients avoiding conventional medicine? That the Holistic Medicine Alliance has financial ties to homeopathy manufacturers? Kennedy's face had shifted from confident to defensive, his stress indicators escalating exactly as interrogation experts would predict. Representative, I can't control who supports our mission. We don't coordinate with donors on their business practices. But you do accept their money, Raskin pressed, his voice rising slightly with controlled intensity. You accept millions of dollars from organizations that profit from the very skepticism toward conventional medicine that your advocacy promotes. Isn't that exactly the kind of financial conflict of interest you've spent decades criticizing in the pharmaceutical industry? The comparison hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be withdrawn. Kennedy attempted to respond but Raskin continued, his rhythm now relentless. Let me read from your own testimony to this committee 3 hours ago, Raskin said, pulling out a transcript. Quote, the pharmaceutical industry's business model requires that we remain skeptical of financial motivations behind medical recommendations. We must follow the money to understand whose interests are being served. End quote. Kennedy's hands were now visibly trembling, a physical manifestation of the psychological pressure building in the room. Representative, there's a fundamental difference between grassroots health advocacy organizations and multinational pharmaceutical corporation. Is there? Raskin interrupted sharply, because according to financial analysis conducted by the Government Accountability Office at my request, your Children's Health Defense Organization has received $47 million over the past 5 years from sources that directly profit from anti-vaccine sentiment, supplement sales, and alternative medicine practices that lack scientific validation. The number landed like a bomb. $47 million. Nearly half what Kennedy had accused Big Pharma of spending on lobbying, flowing into his own organization from sources with clear financial stakes in the message he was promoting. Kennedy tried to formulate a response but Raskin was already moving to his next document, the methodical destruction continuing. Mr. Kennedy, I have here a contract between Children's Health Defense and a consulting firm called Medical Freedom Analytics. Does that name sound familiar? Kennedy's face had gone pale, his usual eloquence replaced by halting uncertainty. I'm not directly involved in all organizational contracts. This contract, Raskin continued, holding up the document so cameras could capture its official seals, shows that Medical Freedom Analytics was paid $375,000 to, quote, develop communication strategies emphasizing pharmaceutical industry corruption and promoting alternative health modalities. The consulting firm is owned by your former campaign manager and is funded primarily by supplement manufacturers. You paid $375,000 in donor money to a firm that helps supplement companies market their products by attacking their pharmaceutical competitors. Kennedy's mouth opened but no words emerged, the weight of the revelation crushing his ability to deflect. Around the hearing room, reporters were frantically typing, recognizing they were witnessing something rare in Washington, a perfect kill shot delivered with documentary precision. Representative, Kennedy finally managed, his voice barely audible, our consulting relationships support legitimate public health advocacy. Legitimate public health advocacy, Raskin said with barely contained contempt, or sophisticated marketing for an alternative medicine industry worth over $50 billion annually? At 11:37, exactly 41 seconds after Raskin had begun reading the Medical Freedom Analytics contract, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. experienced what observers would later describe as the complete collapse of moral authority. The man who had built a career on following the money, who had accused others of corruption for decades, sat frozen as his own financial entanglements were exposed with surgical precision. But Raskin wasn't finished. Mr. Kennedy, let me ask you about something specific. In 2023, you gave 17 speeches warning about pharmaceutical industry influence. In those same speeches, you recommended that Americans consider alternative treatments including supplements, homeopathy, and chiropractic care, correct? Kennedy nodded weakly, knowing where this was heading but unable to stop it. Those recommendations were based on scientific evidence and patient autonomy, were they? Raskin pulled out another document. Because I have financial disclosure forms showing that you personally received speaking fees totaling $290,000 from organizations that sell exactly those alternative treatments. You weren't just advocating for alternatives, you were being paid by the alternative industry to promote their products. The accusation was devastating in its simplicity. Kennedy hadn't just accepted donations, he had been compensated personally for speeches that promoted products sold by his benefactors. It was the exact arrangement he had spent decades condemning in pharmaceutical representatives. Representative, those were legitimate speaking engagements, Kennedy protested weakly. I disclosed all income as required by law. Legal and ethical are different standards, Raskin shot back. You've made a career of questioning the ethics of doctors who receive speaking fees from pharmaceutical companies. You've called it corruption, bribery, institutional capture. But when you do the exact same thing with supplement companies and alternative medicine organizations, you call it legitimate advocacy? The hypocrisy was now undeniable, laid out with mathematical precision that made denial impossible. Several Republican committee members looked genuinely uncomfortable, their earlier enthusiasm for Kennedy's nomination evaporating as the financial evidence mounted. Raskin pressed forward, sensing complete victory within reach. Let me share one final document that I think crystallizes everything we've discussed today. He held up a printout marked with official IRS seals. This is a private letter ruling obtained by Children's Health Defense in 2021. In it, your organization argued that donations should be tax deductible because you provide educational services about health risks. But buried in the supporting documentation is something fascinating. He began reading, his voice carrying the weight of irrefutable evidence. Quote, Children's Health Defense serves a vital public interest by providing information that pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies systematically suppress due to financial conflicts of interest. Kennedy's own organization had explicitly accused others of the exact financial conflicts that Raskin had just proven existed in Kennedy's own operation. The irony was so perfect it seemed almost scripted. Mr. Kennedy, do you see the problem here? You've built an organization funded by industries that profit from medical skepticism. You've accepted millions from supplement manufacturers, alternative medicine advocates, and anti-vaccine activists who have clear financial stakes in the message you promote. You've personally profited from speaking fees paid by these same industries. And you've done all of this while claiming to be an independent truth-teller exposing corporate corruption. Kennedy sat in defeated silence, his hands now clasped tightly together, his famous voice reduced to nothing. Around him, the political calculation was already happening. Republican senators were mentally drafting statements expressing concerns about the nomination. Democratic activists were preparing social media campaigns. Cable news producers were ordering extended coverage. The man who had promised to drain the swamp of corporate influence had been revealed as just another player working for different corporate masters. Supplement companies instead of pharmaceutical companies. Alternative medicine instead of conventional medicine. But corporate influence nonetheless. Raskin delivered his closing statement with the precision of a prosecutor who had just presented an airtight case. Mr. Kennedy, I don't question your sincerity about children's health. I believe you genuinely care about these issues, but you cannot claim moral authority to reform our health system when your own organization operates on the exact same financial model you condemn in others. You cannot criticize pharmaceutical lobbying while accepting millions from alternative medicine lobbying. You cannot attack conflicts of interest while maintaining undisclosed financial relationships with industries that profit from your advocacy. The hearing concluded at 12:14 with Kennedy's nomination in shambles. Within hours, 3 Republican senators announced they could not support the confirmation. By evening, Kennedy's own statement acknowledged financial relationships that, quote, may have created perceptions inconsistent with the transparency I have long advocated. The careful language couldn't mask the reality that his credibility had been destroyed by his own contradictions. The aftermath revealed an even more troubling pattern. Investigative journalists following Raskin's leads discovered that Kennedy's financial entanglements extended far beyond what had been disclosed in the hearing. His speaking fees, book sales, and consulting arrangements had generated over $3 million personally over 5 years, much of it from organizations that directly benefited from vaccine skepticism and pharmaceutical distrust. The alternative medicine industry he had been promoting wasn't a grassroots movement challenging corporate power. It was itself a $50 billion corporate industry using Kennedy as its most visible and effective spokesman. The supplement manufacturers, homeopathy companies, and alternative health practitioners who funded his work weren't motivated by public health concerns. They were motivated by the same profit incentives that drove pharmaceutical companies. Kennedy had simply chosen different corporate masters while claiming independence from all of them. Perhaps most damaging was the revelation that Kennedy's own family had privately expressed concerns about his financial arrangements. Documents obtained by the Washington Post showed that several Kennedy family members had questioned whether his advocacy had become too entangled with commercial interests. One email from his sister Carrie Kennedy used language that would haunt him forever, suggesting that he had become what he claimed to fight against. The political implications extended far beyond one failed nomination. Kennedy's exposure revealed how easily moral authority could be weaponized for commercial purposes regardless of political ideology. It wasn't just pharmaceutical companies that used conflicts of interest to shape public opinion. Alternative medicine industries were equally sophisticated in their use of advocacy organizations, speaking fees, and funded research to promote products and discredit competition. The lesson wasn't that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was uniquely corrupt. The lesson was that financial influence in healthcare operated across all industries and political perspectives, shaping medical discourse in ways that served business interests rather than patient welfare. Sometimes the most effective accountability comes not from lengthy investigations or partisan attacks but from simple documentation of financial relationships that reveal uncomfortable truths. Representative Jamie Raskin had done exactly that, presenting 41 seconds of evidence that destroyed decades of carefully constructed credibility. Can anyone claim independence while accepting millions from interested parties? Can advocates maintain moral authority when their funding sources profit from their message? Does transparency matter only when exposing others, or does it require examining our own financial relationships with equal rigor? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. learned these questions have answers that don't change based on political ideology or good intentions. The $47 million told a story that no amount of passionate speeches could rewrite. If this investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about advocacy and influence, consider how many other respected voices might operate under similar financial arrangements. Understanding who funds the message helps us evaluate the message itself. That principle doesn't change whether applied to pharmaceutical companies or their critics, to conventional medicine or its alternatives. Follow the money. Kennedy had said that phrase thousands of times, never imagining it would ultimately be applied with such devastating effectiveness to his own career.